One that I had planned to preach back a few weeks ago. This is the one that we moved for our student-led service. And so this is one that I've been excited about for quite some time. And so now we get to share it. And honestly, this night feels more appropriate to share it than just a random night back in April or May, or I don't even remember. May? Yeah, it was early May. Because tonight, as we wrap up Spring Fling, this is an appropriate message. And so the message is called Never Stand Alone. And so this message, I know I say this often, so not to just hear this and think like, yeah, whatever. But this message really, I believe, has the power to change your life, to radically kind of redirect the way you view everything. It can change the game for you. And so, for me, there's been many times in my life where I felt all alone. Where different situations have happened, different circumstances I was facing, and there's been times where I felt alone. And if we're honest, everybody has felt alone at one point or another. And if we're honest, those are some of the hardest moments in our life, where you feel just completely isolated. And maybe you're here tonight and you're surrounded by all these people, and yet you still just feel very alone. And so our one big thought, the title of the message, Never Stand Alone. And so what we're going to see, the common thread through everything, is that we're created for connection, but we drift towards isolation. That is the main theme of this whole message, that we were created for connection. We were created for community, to be connected to one another, but yet we drift towards isolation. And so to unpack that statement a little bit, God created you, He created me, He created every single person that you've ever met, ever will meet, and He created you with a purpose. And He created you to have a connection with other people. Because God created everything, right or wrong? Right. And so if you know much about animals, different insects, whatever it is, other forms of life, He didn't create everything for connection, for community. Some animals are very solitary creatures, but then others are more community-based. They hunt in packs. They run they have their little communities, their little tribes, whatever you want to call it. But humans, when He created us not to be isolated. He didn't create us to go through life alone. He created us for connection. Connection with others, but also a connection with Him. And that is what makes us different. No other creation does He long to have this relationship with. It's just us. And so He wants to have a connection with us, and He wants us to have a connection with others. And so today, just by coming in this room, by being here, you belong here, right? That's our theme. That's what we push everywhere. You belong here, and you're a part of the church. And we say that a lot, that you're a part of the church. What is the church? God is building His church. He loves the church. And so when we say that, we're not talking about this room. We're not talking about the building over there. We're talking about His people. The church is not a building. The church is not a place you go. It's a people. It's you. It's me. And in fact, Scripture says it this way in Ephesians when he's talking about the church. In verse 19, it says, "You're no longer strangers or outsiders, but you belong here." And so right now I want to speak to whoever out there feels alone, feels isolated, feels like you just are going through life alone. You don't have any connections. You belong here. You have as much right to this place. You have as much right to God, to a relationship with Him as anyone. God is building His church, and He's using all of us. He used the apostles and the prophets for the foundation that we read and we learn from. And now he's using you and he's using me and he's fitting us together brick by brick, stone by stone, with Jesus as the cornerstone, right? To build his church. And so you're a stone, I'm a stone. Together, God is building his church. And what that means is that we were created to lean on each other, to support each other, to draw strength from each other. Right? I don't know if you've ever played the game of Jenga. I contemplated having a tower here, but then I was like, no shot, it makes it through Foursquare. And also, no shot when I knock it down, everybody doesn't lose their focus. But if you've ever played Jenga, you know the way it works. You have all these blocks, you build them up, and it's relatively strong. But what happens is all those blocks need the other blocks in order for it to stand. And so if you start pulling out pieces, if some of you start getting disconnected, you start letting sports or other things get in the way of your relationship with God and of your connection to this group and to the church, what ultimately happens is that building, that tower falls. Because every block needs the other block in order for it to stand, in order for it to be strong. We support one another. Because we are created for connection. But yet we naturally will drift towards isolation. And so where does that come from? Well, one source that I know, because I experienced it, and one source that I know is just prevalent for everybody, is social media. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, whatever it is that you use, Snapchat. Everybody's on those all the time. Maybe you're not. If you're not, good for you. Don't ever. But most of us are. Most of the world is. And why? Because we long for connection. We want to know what everybody's doing all the time. We want people to know what we're doing. We want to be connected. We want to post something and then we check the likes every 2 minutes to see if the certain person that we posted it for has liked it, see how many people have liked it. We check all these different things. And what happens? It's not that satisfying. It's not that gratifying. But what ends up happening, or what happened for me, was I would go to social media hoping for something, and what I would end up leaving with was feelings of jealousy, or I would be envious of something else that I would see. I'd feel left out. Because what happens is you may open it up and you see a couple of your friends are hanging out, and you didn't get invited, and you're like, what's up with that? Or you open it up and you see, oh, that girl I really liked is with this dude. What's up with that? Now I'm like mad and things are bad. Now I'm sad. It never gives the reaction that we want it to. It leaves us longing. We were created for this connection, but yet everything is pulling us towards isolation. We drift towards isolation. You may be saying, well, that's not that bad. I kind of like being on my own. Kind of like being alone. You know, I'm not really a people person. I'd prefer to just kind of stay at home in my room, do my own thing. Why is that so bad? Oh, that's dangerous, for one. Because, you know, I know we're not animals, but to use the animal thing, what happens when an animal is on its own? Yeah, have you ever seen a lion like hunt any of these, like, you ever ended up on the Animal Planet when nothing else was on? Or like the National Geographic Channel and it's like lions just like going nuts? What do? They find a big pack of animals and then they see which one's by itself, which one's in the back, which one's isolated. I'm gonna go take down that one. And so when we get isolated, when we get in our own little space, disconnected from everything else happening, that's when the devil starts attacking us. Because we're not connected. We don't have that support system. We're on our own. It's just us and our thoughts, and we're just an easy target. And I see it all the time. People getting taken out by the enemy because they were alone. Because they're isolated. Because they don't have that support system. Use some different examples. Think about a relationship. If you're in a relationship, if you've ever been in one person starts to drift. They start to kind of move in a different direction. And instead of moving towards each other, if you're not intentional about working every day towards building that connection, you likely start drifting apart. You start drifting towards isolation. Same thing happens with church. You miss 1 week because of this or that. And then what happens? You're like, man, I feel like I missed out. I'm kind of embarrassed that I had to miss. You feel a little bit ashamed, and then next week when church rolls around, you're like, I don't know if I really want to go back. I don't want everybody asking me why I missed because I don't have a good excuse. And eventually it just becomes this pattern, it becomes this habit of just not coming. And you get disconnected and you get isolated. And so as followers of Christ, we're called to fight the drift. Fight the drift. Fight the drift towards isolation. Because it's a battle, it's a fight, but trust me, this is a fight that's worth fighting. And so how do you win the fight against isolation, against that drift towards isolation? Well, obviously we do it by never standing alone, but there's 3 different things that I have that we're going to look through. But before we jump into that, just to hammer this point home, the most important connection in your life is your relationship with God. Because when you surrender your life to Christ, you enter into this relationship with God, that is how you never stand alone. Because people in your life will come and go, but God is always there. And so that relationship with God is how you never stand alone. You'll face trouble, you'll face hardship, you'll go through battles, through tough times, but with God by your side, you can look back and you can see His faithfulness through the whole thing. And so now 3 things, 3 ways to never stand alone. The first thing you've got to do, the first thing in this fight against the drift is to remember the faithfulness of God. Remember the faithfulness of God. In short, everybody needs God. Can anybody be like, I don't need God? Does anybody not need God? Okay, good. Glad you all know that. There's people in your schools, though, that don't know that. There's people you're going to encounter when you start working, when you go to college, that don't know that. So remembering the faithfulness of God, because everybody needs God. There's a story in the Bible about Joshua. Joshua is the guy that took over leading the Israelites after Moses. Right? And so, to set up this story, the Israelites, we know, have been wandering in the desert for 40 years. Right? This is before they enter the Promised Land. And so the important part that we're looking at is that God speaks to Joshua and He says, pick up 12 stones, stack them here one by one, and remember my faithfulness. Essentially what He's doing is He's building this monument to remember what God has brought them through. And so when we pick up this story in Joshua 4, we start in verse 21. Look at what it says. It says, then Joshua said to the Israelites, in the future your children will ask, what do these stones mean? Then you can tell them, this is where the Israelites crossed the Jordan on dry ground. And so, God's faithfulness to part the waters, to lead them out of captivity. He built this monument so that they could always remember. So that when their children, when their grandchildren ask, what is that pile of rocks for? That's how we remember what God has brought us through. That's how we remember the faithfulness of God. And so if you want to fight the drift towards isolation, you've got to remember what God has done for you. When you feel like you're wandering, you feel like you're growing further from God, you feel that relationship starting to weaken, you're growing weary, you've just been waiting and you feel like nothing's happening, you feel like you can't go on, you feel worn out, you feel alone, you've got to remember the faithfulness of God. Because the God that was walking with His people in this story, the God that brought His people out of captivity, the God that parted the seas, that did all of these things, is the same God that's walking with you today. And so when you need help, He's there. He's going to come through for you. When you're trapped, you feel like you've got nowhere else to go, He's giving you a way out. When you were dead in your sins, he forgave you. God is faithful, but we've got to remember his faithfulness if we want to fight the drift. And the Israelites knew that. That's why they built this monument. I think about our wall over here as a similar thing. To remember what God has brought us through. To remember where you were at when you wrote your name on that wall. Almost a year ago for some of you. How has God changed your life since then? How has he been faithful to what you were going through then? Because he's brought you along this far. And so if we confess our sins, he is faithful and he is just to forgive us. And so remember the faithfulness of God. Now I want to stop and acknowledge that there's probably a group of you that say, I can't see God's faithfulness in my life. Or I can't see where he's been faithful in my past. Because sometimes it's actually really hard to remember God's faithfulness. Because we see what we're going through now, and it's dark, and it's scary, and we don't know how we're going to get through. And we have a hard time remembering that God has brought us this far. We have a hard time remembering what he's done. Maybe you were abandoned by somebody you loved. Or maybe the person that you trusted more than anybody else hurt you, abused you, they did you wrong. Or maybe you watched a loved one, a parent, a grandparent, fighting disease, and it didn't go the way you had hoped. Or maybe you made a mistake, and it messed something up. It hurt your picture of what your life was supposed to be. You know, it hurt what others wanted your life to be, and now you carry this guilt and this shame. Whatever it is that you have, whatever it is that you've faced, where you just can't see God's faithfulness, remember that God has been faithful to bring you through all of that. He hasn't brought you this far to leave you there. Everything that's happened is building you. It's growing you. It's becoming part of your story, as we'll see in a little bit. And so when it's hard to remember God's faithfulness, what do? The second point, rely on God's people. Rely on God's people. Rely on God's people because everybody needs somebody. We need somebody to vent to, somebody to share your doubts, share your fears. You need the right people around you. Because the difference between where you are and where God wants you to be is having the right people in your life, the right influences in your life. You've got to rely on God's people because everybody needs somebody. And again, you may be here. You think, oh, I've got plenty of friends. I got plenty of people around me. I'm not alone. Are they the right people? That's the question you've got to ask, and you've got to be honest with yourself about. Because if I look back at myself when I was in your seat, when I was in high school, I had plenty of friends. I had plenty of people around me. But they were the wrong people. They were the wrong kind of influences. Right? I could stand there and say, I'm not alone. I got plenty of guys around me. But these guys were drinking, they were partying, they were cussing, they were doing all these things that were leading my life in the wrong direction. And why? Because the wrong people are going to give you the wrong result. And so if the wrong people give you the wrong result, what will the right people do? Well, they'll not just give you the right result, but they'll put you in the right direction. They'll help you through those hard times of faithfulness. They'll help you keep your direction. They'll help you keep moving forward and closer to God. Proverbs 14:7 says this. It says, the words of the wise are like weapons of knowledge. And if you need wise counsel, stay away from the fool. Stay away from the fool. Find the right people. Find your people. Find your group, your support system. And I know that's easier said than done. How do you find the right people? Start serving. Right? Find people walking in the same direction. Getting involved in what this youth group is doing. Getting involved in FCA at your school or whatever it looks like. Finding people walking the same walk as you. We're going to be starting small groups here shortly over the summer. Right, as we've talked about. That is a great way to get connected. When you're constantly meeting with people and you're constantly talking to people to grow in your faith. That is how you find the right people. Just getting real with somebody for once. Because everything you see out there online, on social media, on Instagram is fake. It's all fake. And so finding somebody, finding a group that you can just get real with. You can get real about what you're struggling with. You can get real about what you're facing, about what your doubts are. That's how you grow together and you build that community. And so if you're in a small group and you're serving, but yet you still feel like you're isolated, my first instinct would be that you're not opening up to it. You've got to be honest about what you're struggling with to build those relationships. And so if you feel like that, well, today is the day to get that going, to get that ball rolling, to get started building up your people. Because I promise you, if you get connected, if you make church a priority, you come to the Sunday night hangouts, you come on Wednesday nights, you come on Sunday mornings, you come to small group, you get connected, and you don't just come, but you actually open up, you participate, you talk to people, you get real with somebody. You'll look back after some months, maybe some years, and you'll say, that's when I found my people. He's building his church stone by stone. We're created for connection, but we drift towards isolation. So the last thing we're going to look at about being honest, about being open, is that you've got to release the power of your story. Release the power of your story. Every single one of us has a story. What your life has been to this very day. It's a story that isn't over. It's a story that you write every single day when you wake up. You have a story. Things you've faced, things you've been through. Challenges God has brought you through. You've got a story. And so in short, somebody needs you. Somebody needs you because you've got a story and there's power in your story. There's power in your story. Even if you think, I've got a pretty lame story. I grew up in church my whole life. I've never really done anything wrong. I wasn't like a drug addict that went to jail and I have this incredible story. There's power in your story. God has been faithful to you. He's brought you through things. We've all experienced heartache. We've all experienced different trials. And there's power in your story. And so somebody needs you. I want to share quickly the story of David and Goliath, right? The power in that story. We know, again, Goliath came down. He starts talking bad about the Israelites. He starts talking bad about God. But he's a giant, so nobody wants to go and fight this dude. So he tear him up. David comes in. He sees what's happening. He says, "Nuh-uh." He gets his sling, goes out there, goes, knocks him dead. Right? Because David was this big, strong dude that could fight. No. Because he trusted God. Because he had God on his side. But in this story, what I want you to see is that Goliath wasn't David's personal giant. David wasn't in the army. David wasn't out there fighting this guy. Like, David just happened to show up one day bringing food for his brothers and was like, y'all got a problem with this dude? It wasn't his personal giant, but it was the giant that his people, his support system, his family, his friends were facing. He said, you're my people, so your giant now becomes my giant. That's what happens in this group. When you begin to get connected, to build up these relationships, you begin to be that David for somebody else. When you release the power of your story. Because you never know what people are facing. They can have a giant in their life that you've faced before. And so you come along and you help them defeat that. We don't fight these fights alone. And what I think is so interesting about the stones that David used, right? It says 5 smooth stones, right? These river stones. Why are these stones smooth? Is anybody like a rock expert? Why are river stones smooth? Because they hit other rocks. They tumble through this river, through waterfalls, this rushing water, all that stuff, the flowing sand, it acts as sandpaper, and just through tumbling and moving along, they become smooth. And so when you look back at your life, what has God been using that felt like you're just getting tossed and tumbled, that's really just been making you whole, been making you smooth, been getting out all the imperfections, been growing you, molding you into the image of God? The time that you failed, the family situation that you struggled with for so long that almost broke you, the addiction that you're facing that's trying to take you out, the loss of your loved one, the heartbreak, the hurt, the betrayal, what the enemy has been trying to use against you, what the devil meant for bad, God is using for good. Because God works all things out for the good of those who love him. And so maybe, just maybe, if you release the power of your story and you open up and you share about what you've been through, maybe your story can be the stone that takes out somebody else's giant. Maybe the heartbreak and the hurt that you went through that you're like, God, why? It's so that you can now share your story of how God was faithful, of how he brought you out of that. And now you can be what helps somebody else get out of that hole. God's building his church. Stone by stone, you, me, all of us together. And so fight the drift towards isolation. Live for true connection. Make that your number one priority. Because when you do that, you never stand alone. You never stand alone. And so if you're out there and you say, I want to fight against this isolation I've been feeling, I feel alone. I feel like I've got no one that I'm really close to, nobody I can turn to when things are bad. I need the right people in my life. I've got plenty of people, but they're the bad influences. They're leading me in the wrong direction. I know God doesn't want me to go, and I need the right people. Or if you just are finally trying to get to where you have the courage to share your story. Share the parts of your life that you've kept hidden and you've tried to hide. That hurt. Maybe it's time that you begin to share your story to help the other people around you. If that's you, well, it starts with the gospel, right? Us never standing alone starts with us having God in our life. Because the most important connection you need is with God. And so if you've been walking alone, You've been living isolated, apart from God. That was never his plan for you. His plan for us was to never stand alone. And so tonight, whichever one of those applies to you, my hope is that you would address it during this last song. If you don't have a connection to God, you've been living isolated, take that first step. Build up that connection, because God is faithful. He's faithful to forgive. There's nothing you've done, there's nothing you could do to keep him from loving you. And if you've already made that commitment, you've already given your life to Christ, then maybe tonight you just need to start looking for the right people. You need to open up. You need to share your story. You need to find your people, find your group. Start now. Find a group of people to pray with during this last song. Build up your community, because we were not made to go through life alone. We were made for connection. So don't let the devil drag you towards isolation. Lean on one another, support one another in love, because that is what we were meant to do. And so during this last song, you respond however the Lord is leading you. And afterwards, I'll close with a word of prayer.